Everyone has heard of the Sumerians, but not everyone knows that if today we can drink beer and read books, it's also thanks to them. Hey guys, welcome back to Ancient Peoples, the series where we tell you about ancient civilizations and explain why they're important, and above all, why people are still talking about them today. In this second episode, we're going to talk a bit about the Sumerians, because the Sumerians are probably the quintessential ancient people. Everyone knows about them, everyone has heard of them, but probably many of you don't actually remember much about them. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that in this series, we want to try something a bit new. Part of the video footage you'll see will be created using artificial intelligence. That said, let's get started. Picture a land that's arid, mountainous, and desert-like. We're in the Tigris Mountains, between Iran and Iraq, and here, about 10,000 years ago, there were peoples who managed to survive only thanks to hunting and gathering. At a certain point, they realized that further east there were two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and that the land between them was fertile. So this was land that could be cultivated. This was Mesopotamia, meaning Meso as in between and Potamus as in river, the land between the rivers. So they began to sow the fields, and in a short time they discovered that, thanks to the canals and the water from the two rivers, it would be easier to farm the land. So they started to farm and to build villages around the fields, giving rise to what is known as the agricultural revolution. Just think, thanks to the abundance and wealth that developed in this context, what were once villages gradually grew and became real cities, the most famous of which is Uruk, which was the first city in world history, between 4500 and 3000 BC. But hold on a second, exactly how long ago are we talking about? Because it can be hard to really grasp when we're dealing with dates that far back in time. So, just to give you an idea, the Colosseum, which we already think of as something incredibly ancient, was built about 2,000 years ago. That means the time that has passed between us and the Colosseum is less than half of the time that passed between the Colosseum and the beginning of Sumerian civilization. But let's get back to our topic. We said that Mesopotamia was a fertile land, so the Sumerians soon began to farm, making agriculture the foundation of their society. Just think, thanks to their skill in farming, the Sumerians were able to grow more and more crops. And they even figured out how to use the fermentation of grains to make an alcoholic drink that we still drink today, beer. I mean, the Sumerians, 5,000 years ago, invented beer, and they liked it so much that they even dedicated a goddess to it, called Nikasi. Though we'll talk more about Sumerian religion in a bit. Once they had so many cultivated fields, they realized they also had a lot of harvest, and from there, two needs arose. First, they needed a way to know exactly how much food was in the warehouses. Second, they needed someone to manage the farmers and all the harvested goods. The first problem was solved in a way that might seem obvious to us today, but at the time it was revolutionary, using pointed sticks to mark the amount of supplies on clay tablets. Obviously, with this method it was inconvenient to draw curves, so the grooves they left were wedge-shaped. And that's where cuneiform writing came from. For example, this symbol means dwelling. So basically, the Sumerians invented one of the first forms of writing in history specifically to manage the huge amount of resources they had. And then they took this invention and used it to document their society and tell real stories, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells of this divine king who sets out on a journey in search of immortality. But let's move on, because after inventing writing, as we were saying, the Sumerians had to solve another problem, managing all the farmers and the resources they produced. And so, the role of the official was created, that is, an educated person who could read and write and was able to administer the kingdom, occupying a rung on the Sumerian social ladder just below the king. Obviously, being able to read and write wasn't as common as it is today. So, what did the Sumerians do? Not satisfied with having already invented so many things, they even came up with schools, where the children of the wealthiest families could study to one day become officials themselves. Writing also allowed them to develop some concepts in arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, some of which still exist today. Just to give you an idea, okay, they counted using a sexagesimal system, so they counted in 60s. 60 minutes, 60 seconds, the 360-degree angle. So these are all things that are simply a legacy of the Sumerians. Anyway, once all this work of managing the harvest in an organized way was done, it naturally followed that real cities gradually began to form around the fields. In fact, these were city-states, each surrounded by walls. Like any self-respecting city-state, each one had a ruler who lived in the royal palace. But the king wasn't the only figure that was essential within a city-state. Do you remember when I talked to you about Sumerian religion? Well, just below the king and on par with the officials, there was the class of priests. In every city, there was always a temple built in the shape of a stepped pyramid, the famous ziggurat. This structure had a large staircase on one side that allowed people to reach the top. Here there was a small sanctuary dedicated to the city's deity. Then, on the lower floors, for example, there were the living quarters of the priests and officials, who, as we've seen, were just below the king on the social ladder, as well as some craft workshops and storage rooms. Again, because agriculture was so central to the Sumerians, they placed the storage rooms right inside the temple. Speaking of religion, the Sumerians were a polytheistic people, so they had multiple deities. And often, in fact, the cults of different deities developed in different city-states, which over time began to merge, creating a single religion based on many gods. Among the most important are the god of the sky, Enlil, the god of the wind, and Enki, the god of fresh waters, knowledge, and creation. Well, we've taken an overview of Sumerian culture, and we've understood why they're still important to us today. But what happened to the Sumerian people? Well, let's just say that having city-states comes with a problem. That is, the cities were often at war with each other, and these conflicts were their own downfall, because in 2350 BC, Sargon, king of Akkad, began conquering the Sumerian city-states, and together with his grandson Lamsin, created the first empire in world history that included all the regions known at the time, from the Persian Gulf to Turkey and from Iran to the Mediterranean Sea. So is that how the Sumerians ended? Actually, no. About 200 years later, some former Sumerian cities managed to regain power, and in Dur, located near the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates, a new kingdom was born, around 2000 BC. However, these people had to start dealing with a new group, the Amorites. They were a nomadic people who came from the northwest. The Amorites actually managed to seize power in the city-states of Mesopotamia and were even able to create new kingdoms. And so the Babylonian civilization was born, thanks to the great ruler Hammurabi. But that's another story. Alright guys, thanks for sticking with me up to this point. I hope you enjoyed this video. A special thanks to Professor Nicola Laneri for his support. And I'll see you again in the next video.